Hello, welcome, thanks for coming. This is an event that's been organised by BA Culture, Criticism and Curation in conjunction with our show, which is upstairs in C202, which we've titled This New Feeling. There's a publication which accompanies the show, which you can see online, thisnewfeeling.com. And there's also articles, interviews with the artists, podcasts, things on there that you can refer back to. And there's also going to be some drinks afterwards upstairs on the terrace. If you are blessed with a purple wristband, be great to see you all there. Happily sponsored by Courvoisier and Blandies. So the speakers today are Robin van den Akker, who is the co-author of the essay, Notes on Metamodernism, and co-founder of the website, and Luke Turner and Nastya Ronko, who are 2/3 of their collaboration, LaBeouf, Ronko and Turner. So here for your pleasure and absolute, revelation, hopefully. Over to you, Robin.
All right.
If I can switch this right.
Switch on.
Does this work? Yes. Right, yeah? Everybody hears me all right?
Good. Let me briefly set up. I made this makeshift lectern here because I need to keep track of myself with two things. First, these notes. And second of all, a timer, because I'm infamous for running really late, Fidel Castro-like style. So I put this on. I didn't put an alarm, so if I'm running late, just chop my head off. All right. So basically in 2010, and I have a third device, which is this lovely PowerPoint. All right, all set up, and a clicker. Yes. All right. In 2010, my colleague and I, Jim Vermeulen, published an article, Notes on Metamodernism, which we think now is a terribly flawed article. It contains many errors, things are not clear at all, that should have been developed much more. But with the benefit of hindsight, it actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because nowadays we use it as some kind of song, you would say, in Wikipedia terms, of our website that we're running together with also, for example, the Lewis editor and 3 other editors. It serves as a stop for the website, and because of its flaws, it really triggered a lot of debate. And it also sort of enabled and left the debating space open for a lot of young people of my age, but also of your age, to write their own articles on that site. And so we sort of created this collaborative web space, this research platform, on which we try to map and analyze all kinds of changes in contemporary culture and the arts. And we sort of keep, we sort of use the name Metamodernism as a placeholder for the website. I think it's really important to say, because it's not just me who's developing this, but it's basically me and a whole editorial team and dozens of contributors on that site. So, when we speak about metamodernism, we don't speak about a certain artistic movement. We don't try to pigeonhole artists. We don't try to say this is metamodernism and this is not metamodernism. But basically what we try to do is see what is being produced in the art world. And especially what is being produced by young artists. Young artists that could be considered to be part of the millennial generation, you could say. Born around the 1980s or later. So we try to map what is going on in the arts, and we're doing so because we ultimately want to make a cultural analysis. We want to find out what is going on around us today. And we think that's important because when we were starting to discuss this notion of metamodernism, Tim and I, we were basically teaching our students from books that were written in the 70s and the 80s and in the 90s, think of Baudrillard, for example. And for us, those books did not speak for the things that we were experiencing. There was not a language out there that could account for all the things that we were seeing popping up around us. And the language is so important because it's only when you have the language that allows you to speak about your everyday life but you can also start to see the things that still need to be done in terms of the future. So, what I want to do today is briefly look at this notion of feeling. We often use the notion structural feeling, which you will see here. And I will briefly explain that later on. So, briefly look at this notion of feeling. Then I will try to sort of map in popular aesthetics why we thought that there was a new feeling emerging in 2000. And why 2000 itself are such an important decade. In the sense that 2000s is not a temporal decade of 10 years, but for us it's a period. A period that has the same historical importance for Metamodernism as the 60s had for postmodernism. Then I will briefly turn to the debate on the end of history and what we think is happening now, the return of history. And then lastly, I will map out, by using all kinds of examples from the art, a return of what you could call historicity in culture. A certain sense, sort of unblocking of what was long very much blocked. Namely, the ability to think the present historically, the ability to conceive of the present in terms of a lineage that runs from sort of pre-capitalist times towards an alternative future, and the ability to start to envision what that future could look like. So that is briefly what I want to do, and I want to end with some notes that I just jotted down in the train this morning of things that have been bothering me personally. So up until that point it's sort of what we have done with a lot of other people, and then it's just me ranting about my own personal concerns. But I want to briefly go into the political implications of this project. So, are we just mapping culture? Or are there also political aspects that may go unnoticed? And also, yes, there are a lot of things happening that we can be very enthusiastic about. And there is a certain cultural impulse that you could call an optimism of the will. But at the same time, there are also a lot of things happening that evoke a certain pessimism of the intellect, you could say. There are still a lot of things going awfully wrong in our societies. And I want to see how Metamodernism relates to that, if you allow me. And if I have still time. Alright, structural feeling. We started thinking about Metamodernism as a structure of feeling. And that's a really odd notion. It's developed by Williams throughout his oeuvre basically, and not in a very elaborative way, just like in bits and pieces, in this essay, in that essay. But it has become a really influential notion. It has been picked up, for example, by Jameson and by David Harvey in their economical books about postmodernism. But it remains a very odd notion. Because what is a structural feeling? And Williams says it is a particular quality of experience. It is historically distinct from other particular qualities. And it gives a sense of a generation and a period. And I mean, when you're in the humanities, and we are now, I'm a lecturer in humanities, and we're under attack from all kinds of quantifiable, social scientist kind of people, all these words are there. Right? You cannot measure a feeling, you cannot quantify a feeling. The notion of generation, period, completely debated. But still, I'm going to stick to my guns and use just this notion. So it has these two components, right? It has this very hard aspect, structural, and there's this very soft overtones, feeling. And what Williams basically tries to evoke by using this term is that in every period, in every historical period, there is something that is lived by you and me today, but in previous periods by other people, that is lived and experienced that you cannot pin down. You can look at intellectual histories, you can look at the customs of the day and age, but what it really meant to live in that particular period is impossible to trace. But still it's very important, because still it informs every little aspect of our behavior. That is the experience that we sort of need to translate into the way we think, the way we act, the way we do. So Susan Sontag talks about sensibility in Notes on Camera, which is related to this notion, basically. And she says just that. And you can look at intellectual history, you can look at social history, but you still will not be able to grasp what this structural feeling is. But it is there. And it is structural. It has a sort of internal coherency, you could say. And, more importantly, it is also related to all kinds of structural changes, changes that you can pin down within society. Structural changes in terms of demographics, for example. Structural changes in terms of economics. Structural changes in terms of technologies that you're at your disposal. But still, we got stuck with this notion of structural feeling. One of the privileged, you could say, points of access into that structural feeling is the arts, William says. And I agree, it's the very basis of our methodology. So it is through the arts, William says, that you can have some kind of vantage point, some kind of way in this structural feeling. It is the artist that mediates what it means to live in a certain day and age. It's the artist that tries to grapple with the experience of social life. So that is what I'm going to do later on. But first I want to look a little bit into some of the more popular aesthetic forms that emerged in the 2000s. It's terribly hot. So I'm going to undo my jacket. Didn't iron my shirt, but yeah, too late for that. Yeah, these are the more popular forms of aesthetic that emerged in the 2000s. And even here you already start to get some kind of hunch, some kind of idea about this sensibility, about the structural feeling. And it's still a little bit vague, but at least should be clear, is that the structural feeling is completely different from the structural feeling from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and the postmodern structural feeling, you would say. So just a few examples. In our first article we had this case study, and it's just that, it's a case study about neo-romanticism. And what is so interesting there, this is Charles Avery, what is interesting there is that these neo-romantic artists, you could call them, in the early 2000s, try to re-signify everything. They try to come up with all kinds of possible worlds and alternative universes. And that is very much different, you could say, from the practices of, for instance, one of those canonical sort of groups of the postmodern years, the young British artists. What they were mostly doing was deconstructing everyday life, showing how shit it is to live in a consumer society, showing that there are all kinds of power relations that define womanhood, womenhood, that are subjectifying us. So they were basically looking at the here and now, their here and now, and they were deconstructing it, taking it apart. What these artists are doing, they are not only taking it apart, but they try to come up with alternatives, with other possible worlds. You try to signal? No? Okay, sorry. Then in music, you see the free folk movement coming. You don't have to like all these things, right? It's just that these are very dominant themes in all kinds of popular artistic forms. So the free folk movement culminates, you could say, Mumford & Sons, for example, which is one of the most popular bands in the world right now. And what is so interesting there is that they set out from a sort of critique of the punk scene and grunge. So they see, for example, in Nirvana, that Kurt Cobain is completely cynical and in desperation about this consumer society, this notion of fame. He's literally banging his head against the wall because he doesn't see a way out. It's terribly cynical, that music. And what these guys are doing, they are saying, look, we understand the rage, we understand all this, but what we need today is coming up with alternative forms of belief. So what they try to do in their shows, for example, a lot of these groups, is bringing people on stage, making music together, sort of hippie kind of commune-like feeling they try to create. And again, whatever you think of that, it is completely different from what we had in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in popular music. And then, of course, in film, when you think back of all those famous films of the 90s, like Happiness or American Beauty, and that was also called smart film, where, as my colleague Tim, he explains it much better, he's a film star, but he always told me that the camera there sort of zooms out and just is very blank and doesn't feel with the characters. The camera just looks at the characters while you do all kinds of nasty things. Remember Happiness and the sort of pedophilia going on. And there's no command, they just register that. And that's it, it's completely blank. And then in the 2000s you get all these sort of quirky movies, as James McDowell describes it. Quirky movies that do feel with their characters. Quirky movies that are not just ironical or keep some kind of cynical distance, but really engage in a sincere way with the fictional universe that is being created in those movies. So Roy Tenenbaums would be one more or less recent example. And then in architecture, of course, the 70s, 80s, and 90s are very well known for the architects that are popping up, the Bilbao effect, all that super playful formalism in architecture, super spectacular. And that is not necessarily disappearing, but what you see happening in the 2000s that architects are engaging, you could say, with all the issues we have around sustainability and climate change. All of a sudden you do see enormous wild forms, but they have another aesthetic. They start to be eroding icebergs, like this one by Herskin in the Hall, or glaciers in the work of Snohetta, or eroding mountains in the work of Dick. So there's this whole aesthetic of sort of geology or ecology that is seeping into contemporary architecture. It's not just bling bling. I wrote my research master here at the University of Birmingham about the bull ring. And basically the bull ring is one giant block in the color of a pagoda bond dress with silver discs. Well, that is more or less what I had as an image when I was a student of modern architecture. Well, this is different. And then you get as well things like the new aesthetic. I mean, science fiction in the 80s and the 90s, think of Neuromancer, Ibsen, etc. Was really that science fiction. It was about a world that was completely other in a sense. Also a bit dystopian, a bit dangerous, a bit scary. And with this sort of design-inspired movement, new aesthetic, you start to see that science fiction, the future, actually is not the future anymore. It has become part and parcel of our everyday life. And we do not speak about cyberspace anymore, something that is apart from everyday life, but we speak about a hybrid space where the internet and everyday life start to merge. Well, I can go on and on, maybe last two things. What's also very interesting is this sort of greenwashing that you see in advertising. I have here the example of McDonald's that all of a sudden start to stylize themselves as if they were some kind of ecological warriors, which of course they are not. They're terrible, it's a terrible organization. But they're green, right? You see the result of Coca-Cola. You see with Shell, who all of a sudden had advertisements that they were saving the earth, but they were actually slashing out all their R&D on renewables. But it speaks for the sensibility, that all of a sudden we have concern about what we're doing to the earth. That these companies are just sort of riding on that wave to sell their products, that's another thing. But that concern is there. And then maybe the most famous quote of the last 10 years by David Foster Wallace, the writer David Foster Wallace. And of course he writes this already in the early 90s, but throughout the 90s and especially in the 2000s, the critical claim of his work and the number of people that directly point to David Foster-Wallace as some kind of inspiration or an influence on their own work tremendously increases, right? And basically what he says is that, yes, sarcasm, parody, absurdism, and irony are great ways to strip off Stahl's mask. And that's what we see a lot in the 80s and the 90s. Whether it's in Bret Easton Ellis, an American Psycho, who is depicting this Wall Street type, who actually can't find any meaning in life, and spins out of control by finding meaning in murdering people in more gruesome and gruesome ways. And that is sort of a social critique. So again, you see this echo of what's happening in the 80s and 90s, that it is often a critique, and often very good art, I'm not saying that, but then it just does that, criticizing the here and the now. And that is what David Foster-Wallace says. The problem is then that once the rules of art are debunked, and once the unpleasant realities, the irony diagnosis are revealed and diagnosed, then what do we do? And I think that towards the end of the 90s, in the turn of the millennium, a lot of artists and a lot of people in popular culture, a lot of people of our generation maybe, start to ask that question. Yes, we deconstructed this. Yes, we criticized it. But still, what do we do now? Alright. Last thing, in 2000 we also see this resurgence of all kinds of protest movements. And this protest movements neatly bookends, you could say, the 2000s as a period. And you get in the end of the 90s, you get the anti-globalist movement, but you also get the rise of populism and anti-European sentiments, and anti-immigration sentiments. And then in 2011 you have Occupy and a sort of radicalization of all these populist nationalists. Here, UKIP, for example, which is not of the same order as the Golden Dawn, of course. Don't want to say that, but in Holland we have Geert Wilders. There are a lot of these parties that are getting bigger, bigger, and bigger. All right. So you see all these things emerging, and Tim and I saw all these things emerging in 2009. And at the same time, as Tim was approaching it from the arts, and I was approaching it from sort of this aftermath of the crisis, in which I was very interested what would happen now. We started to grapple with this other text that we had been reading studiously while we were students in the early 2000s. There was this text by Francis Fukuyama, who writes, of course, about the end of history, who says that with the unabashed victory of liberal democracy, mankind had achieved a form of society that satisfied its deepest and most fundamental longings. Basically saying that, yes, we have institutional frameworks here, that is deregulated capitalism, we have liberal democracy, and all the countries in the world would slowly but surely march towards that same lofty goal, basically trying to get to the point where the West, according to Fukuyama, already was. So there was this sense of an end. That's also how Jameson describes, for example, the structural feeling as a sense of an end. And this sense really, for me when I was a student, when I was 24, I really believed this. That indeed this was the end of history. This is the end point. Everything has been answered for, nothing to do anymore. But of course, as Jameson says, this notion of the end of history is not about time at all. Rather, it's about space. And it is such a clever inversion, if you will, because it really shows what was happening. So with Jameson, it is about space because you see two developments. On the global level, you see that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the opening of the Chinese markets, that capitalist markets were starting to envelope the whole globe. And that it was being done under the hegemony of the West. And at the same time, he says, on a local level, we are really in an enormous comfort zone. The comfort zone because there's a lot of political stability. We all remember the moment of the third way, where the left and the right sort of met in the middle, started to shake hands, agreeing basically on Fukuyama's thesis that indeed the market should be the best way of organized society. But also a comfort zone in terms of the economy. The economy was booming. There were these promises of endless growth, promises of the end of inflation. So in the 90s especially, there was no reason to doubt this thesis about the end of history. There was no reason at all why indeed this wouldn't be the end of the line. And it's precisely this, because it's a comfort zone, it's a space that is sort of enclosed. Jameson says, our historical imagination got blocked. We didn't have any capacity anymore to think about alternative futures and to think about alternative ways of organizing our societies. And then in the 2000s, I think you can see that starts to shift. That both on the global level and that local level, things really start to change. You get all kinds of geopolitical crises. The rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, they start to challenge Western hegemony. They want their own, that enter the sort of the race for resources in their respective regions. We have the financial and economic crises, starting in 2008, with the enormous household debts that spiraled into debts of nations, into falling banks, etc. And there's now still an economic crisis, 6 years later. And of course we have the ecological crisis. The very fact that we have a really small window to do something about changing the climate. And that awareness has seeped into our consciousness, you could say, increasingly in the 2000s. And then at the end of the 90s, we also have this democratization of ICTs. All of a sudden, it wasn't just hackers that were able to use computers. We couldn't just use computers in our office building. But all of a sudden, in our homes, we were capable of creating things, of connecting with people. And of course, there's all kinds of nasty consequences. Think of the NSA. But bottom line, it is a big change when you compare it to the TV years of that end of history, where you were just sitting behind that screen, taking it all in. At least here you have the possibility of connecting with people. And also at the end of the 90s, you have this, basically this proliferation of renewables. All of a sudden, solar energy, for example, is plummeting in costs. And since 2010, it has become cheaper than nuclear energy. And around 2009, I believe, the total amount of renewable energy that is being produced is surpassing already nuclear energy. So you see here as well that there are a lot of structural changes that change as well the way that we experience the world, the way that we can see the world, and also the way we can act in the world. And then, of course, around the millennium, we also have the first members of the millennial generation that are coming of age. Born in the early 80s, and they turned 18, 19, 20 around the year 2000. And they come into their own in a world that was full of promise, was splendid, was very rich. When I was studying philosophy, everybody said, yeah, of course, study philosophy. You'll get a job, don't worry. Student loan, take a student loan, you'll pay it back, don't worry. And when I have to speak to my students, they are completely stressed out. They really just want to gather as much trophies for their CV in order to enter the job market. But I'm betting that when they're 30, they all have a burnout. They're completely stressed out. Completely anxious about what the future holds. And when they enter the job market, it's probably some kind of flex worker, right? From a short-term contract to another short-term contract, a life of precariousness, probably never owning a home, as our parents had. Here in London, it's even, what's happening here in London is incredible. I read that 80% of all people, in terms of income, cannot even rent a flat in the center of London. I mean, it is really scary. So that world is changing. We all grew up in some kind of wealth, and all of a sudden that world has changed completely. I will leave the photo, the image for you. It says in Dutch, I'm a hypocrite, but I keep trying. And the loop will go into that we just described. So, within this setting, this period, we also see emerging all kinds of new art practices. And as I said, these art practices all speak for this renewed desire, you could say, or this renewed capacity to think the present historically, to see yourself as part of a longer historical development, and also maybe as being part of some kind of future that we still don't know. But we really will try hard to reach and hold different sensibility, you could say, than the end of history sensibility of the 90s. When you look at 5 tropes, and again, this is not a limited list. This list can be extended endlessly, probably can be compiled in a much better way by other people, but these sort of 5 tendencies we have seen emerging in the 2000s and becoming dominant after 2008-9, you could say. And what you see here is that artists once more want to engage in a really political manner with the world around them. You see that the notion of storytelling is again popping up. That we're moving in terms of sensibility beyond irony. I'm not saying that irony is over, but we try to move beyond this position that always says, yeah, I know I say this, but you probably notice that I don't really mean it. Affect, not in a way, in an ontological way, like Deleuze would have it, but affect that is being used to form some kind of bond, you could say, to communicate certain things around commonalities between the people involved. And craft, which I put between brackets because we probably won't have time to talk about it. Talking about time, how much do I have? Okay. So I will just give 2 examples. This is one of my favorite examples. It's Annabelle Daoud. Which side are you on? And she asked a question to people on the street, right? And then it's you record it, and you can hear that when you're in the gallery space in front of the very old television. What's so interesting about the question, which side are you on, is that it's an impossibly broad question. And you also see that in the reaction of people to this. And they start to make jokes, for example, or they start to stutter, or they don't really have an answer yet, or they just say whatever comes up in their mind first. But it's a really difficult question. And it is also so difficult because we were brought up with the idea that we didn't have to choose at all. Right? That we had all the options in the world. That we could do whatever we want when we would grow up, let's say it like that. We just leave it still. And it's also such a difficult question because we've also learned from the postmodernists that choosing one position and sticking to your guns and excluding all other positions is a really dangerous practice. That saying, this is where I stand for, will always give the reaction, well, that is what you think. Right? This notion of sort of relativism that allows you to constantly shift positions without any consequences. That is really characteristic for the postmodern use. But here, she asks you, please take a position. Take a side now. And of course, we are forced to take a side now. I mean, what's going on in the world today in terms of social inequality, in terms of climate change, in terms of the whole neoliberalization of our institutions, forces us to take a side, forces us to take a position. But it's really damn hard to make sure that you're 100% positive about that position, about what you think, and why you say that, and why you're on that particular side. Because, as I said, it's not something that we grew up with, but also because of the internet. This constant deluge of information that is running onto your keyboard. So the moment you say, for example, yeah, climate change, all the extreme weather events are definitely man-made. They're related to our CO2 output. And the next moment you get another report that says, well, it might not be like that. It's much more nuanced. So what do you do then? How do you maneuver this space? In the postmodern years, you didn't have this problem at all. This is Nam Pike in his video wall. And what I find so interesting about this piece is that it's basically just broadcasting thousands and thousands and thousands of channels. And it doesn't force you to choose at all between those information streams. You can just stand there and take it all in. Jameson compares it in one particularly inspired move with David Bowie, the film The Man Who Fell to the Earth. So David Bowie is from outer space, falls to the Earth, and he has this capacity to take in a lot more information than we humans. So you see a lot of scenes, him sitting in his living room, leaning back, while television gets stacked up there, and he just is completely relaxed. He's just leaning back, no care in the world. He doesn't have to move, doesn't have to do anything. I think this contrast shows that yes, we do want to engage, we do want to become politically active, but we're rather unsure about the ways in which we can do that, the way in which we can defend those particular decisions to become engaged. I'll skip this. Storytelling. Just very briefly, Oscar Santillon, Ecuadorian artist, Xavier. What is interesting in this work, it's basically constructed around the desire of Jung, the psychiatrist, to want to go to the Americas and smell the jaguars. And he was never able to fulfill that particular desire. It was a dream he had, but it never came true. So what Oscar Santillon did, he devised from the birth charts of Jung a bag for a vacuum cleaner. Then went to the Americas as the shaman to point to a good location to suck up the scent of the jaguar and then put it in a little marble thingy. What is so interesting here is that there is a strange notion of opportunity and possibility. So what Santillon does is he looks back at history at all the missed opportunities that were there and he revisits them in order to see if we can do something with those missed opportunities in the present. If maybe, if we just look back at history and see where we have gone wrong or what we have missed out, we can reinvigorate our own relationship with history and the future. This one I will skip. Guido van der Werve, number 8. Everything will be alright. So basically it was a video that I was. So basically you see this giant icebreaker. He's walking on the ice towards you, but you don't know where he's going actually. And of course the giant icebreaker is going to run over his little man. Of course the giant icebreaker is going to kill him, right? But still the video is called Everything Will Be Alright. And he just keeps walking. Just keeps walking. What I find interesting here in terms of historicity is that it's really clear that there's a looming danger of catastrophe in terms of the climate, right? There's a looming danger there. And it's not even a looming danger anymore. Scientists start to say, hey look, if you don't act now, it will be too late. And this guy pretends that, of course he notices it, but he puts up a brave face and he keeps walking towards the horizon. He doesn't know exactly where he's going to, but he knows that he needs to start walking, he needs to keep walking in order to not be overrun by this giant ship. And again, I think this speaks for our sense of history in the future. We do know and we do try to cast and project a certain future, a certain historical horizon. But it's very hard to find the language and the vocabulary for that particular horizon. Okay, this is the last giant example, I would say. So on the top you see David Thorpe, and below you see Richard Hamilton, just what it is. It makes today's home so appealing, so pleasant. 1950s, I believe. David Thorpe is early 2000, 2001. And what struck me, but I think what strikes you immediately when you look at these pictures, is that they have sort of the same mise en scène, right? They have sort of the same lines, the sloping line here on the left corner, for example, this plateau here in the middle. They have sort of the same mise en scène, these kind of works. They really resonate with each other. They also have use the same technique, montage. But whereas Hamilton uses all kinds of paper cuttings from the popular press, mostly structured around consumerist ideals, like the bodybuilder, like the Playboy model, like television, like all kinds of luxury items. David Thorpe is constructing this world from leaves and leather, all kinds of natural materials. That is one thing that stands out immediately. Also what is clear is that Hamilton is deconstructing and taking apart the consumer society that he starts to see emerging around him in the 50s. And it's also clear that this is a very, very serious critique of that consumer society. And just what it is that makes today's home so appealing, so pleasant, is of course a very ironic title. Basically, is what he's saying, hey, you idiots, stop buying all that shit. Also, there's no reference at all to the future. It's just this particular world, this particular moment. And the only reference that there is to the past is the 1930s kind of image that you can see when you look through the window. But actually, within this fictional world, within this artwork, that functions as mere decoration, you would say. So it's really this self-enclosed moment that really speaks and really resonates with this emerging comfort zone that I earlier spoke of at the end of this. Well, David Thorpe is constructing this world out of the remnants, you could say, out of the debris of our civilization. Civilizations, I have to say. You see references to Nietzsche and his tightrope walk. You see references to religion. You see references to Japanese woodcutting. You see references to sci-fi. References to the Far West, cowboys and Indians. This world is built out of all kinds of failed utopias, all kinds of failed historical projects. But nevertheless, he uses them to construct this fictional universe. It's an impossible universe because A, all these worlds have been proven to be impossible or dangerous, and B, they cannot exist together, physically impossible. But still, he brings them all together to attempt to create this world. And also, it is not an individual consumer space, it is what you could say sort of a commune. It has this feel of a commune or a sect, some kind of remote group that is really working and collaborating together within that particular spot. And whereas the title of Hamilton is purely ironic, you see that irony here is also present. The title here is Covenant of the Elect. And of course, it is so grandiose that it can also be taken as being ridiculous. But at the same time, when you look at his work, you're not so entirely sure whether it's indeed ironic. It might as well be sincere. So that is what you can see in a lot of those post-ironic works. They're not cutting away an ironic stance, they're not saying this is over and done with, but they try to, for a moment, as some kind of performative gesture, overcome this irony, keep it in bounds, as it were. And you're never quite sure whether you should take this ironically or sincerely. How much time do I have? I think about 5 minutes. 2. Alright, that's the example. What do we have? Yeah, it turns that it's a nice visual effect as well. It turns that irony sincerity balance. This is work by Akker. Again, into the video that I'm going to skip, but basically you see in this sort of ballroom setting, which reminds you of the 1950s, a happier time, more innocent time, you could say. While he's singing sorrow conquers happiness. And he keeps singing that for 50 minutes, 60 minutes, and it's in a loop. The sorrow conquers happiness. And it's a terribly cynical thing to say, right? This is sort of happy 1950 setting, and he says, look, this is all not going to work out well. Sorrow will eventually conquer happiness. But by singing it for 50 minutes long, at some kind of mantra almost ritualistic way, by changing the tone, and changing the melody, and changing the structure, it really tries to find some form of signification within this performance itself. So he says on the one hand, hey, he makes one really ironic gesture, but his performance is not ironic at all. There's no single ironic thing to detect in his performance. And again, that speaks for this weird post-ironic moment that we see. Okay. And his singing also, this effect, you could say, is also used in a very, that's my beeper, instrumentalized to form all kinds of new relations between the artist, but you also see this happening in literature, for example, between the writer and the audience, or the onlook. It's really a communicated form of affect, not just affect that says, hey, this is what I feel, this is what I want to express, but really an affect that tries to draw in the audience, tries to create some sort of moment that is structured around commonalities, she would say. All right. So let's skip these examples. So to round this off, there's this lovely quote by Susan Sontag again. It says, to name a sensibility, to draw its contours, and to recount its history requires a deep sympathy modified by revulsion. And I've put it in because for me it's really important to emphasize that, yes, I'm really enthusiastic about a lot of these developments in the arts and maybe some in the culture, but I have also a lot of things that just anger me, a lot of troubles, you could say, with the things that I'm seeing around me. And as I said, I prepared a little overview of my thoughts on that topic. And because it is often said that what we try to map and the way we map it is just very optimistic. And as I said, there is a certain tendency of optimism in culture. But I think that there is much more going on. If you just allow me, it's 5 minutes. Is that okay still? Yeah? I will read what I wrote this morning in the train. And first it's the summary, and then it goes into the political implications of all this. So, Metamodernism for me, I wrote this morning, it's a sort of dominant cultural logic in the end, right? It's a recurring pattern, you could say, of certain ways of doing and thinking that are decidedly different from postmodern ways of doing and thinking. Yet this logic or pattern did not emerge in a vacuum. We have seen in this talk that it's very much intertwined with new conditions, a new structure of feeling, and, I would like to add, new forms of ideology and ideological forms. So first, we have seen that the social, technological, and economic conditions with which this cultural logic is intertwined gradually emerged on either side of the turn of the millennium and matured, gelled, and combined in the 2000s, which, when seen as a historical period, rather than a temporal decade, lasts from the late 90s to 2011. So think, for instance, here of the new forces of production that mature at the end of the 90s, and the deepening and radicalization of the neoliberalization of our institutions in the ongoing aftermath of the 2008 crises. or the shift from the preeminence of white-collar labor to no-collar labor of the so-called urban creative economy. But also think of the rise of the BRICS and the new global elite that is buying property for fun and driving all other socio-economic classes out of cities like London and New York, Paris and Amsterdam. Or lastly, the whole new cycle of struggles that is marked by Seattle 1999 and Occupy on the other. So secondly, we have seen that the structural feeling with which this cultural logic is intertwined emerged too in the 2000s. So for Jameson, this was related to a structural feeling of endings. Postmodernism was related to that. The end of history, the end of ideology, the end of the subject, the end of art. And it was expressed in many different forms, in pastiche and eclecticism, nostalgia, film, photorealism, and so on. Yet for us, metamodernism is a structural feeling associated with the increasingly widespread sentiment that each of these debates are starting anew, are being kick-started. This structural feeling too finds its expression in many different languages that have been described in detail by others. So you can think of the new aesthetic and new romanticism, etc., what I just discussed. Now, whatever you may think of all these social and artistic developments, good or bad, positive or negative, or whatever, is not to the point, as those are moral judgments that do not have a place in any cultural analysis, depending finally very much on your place on the political spectrum. I, personally, am very enthusiastic about some of them, I'm very angered by many of them, and couldn't care less about most of them. So let me explain this. Imagine that you draw these 5 artistic practices that I described on transparent maps that you stack onto each other and that then lay over the cultural landscape, so as to chart their resonations and their reverberations across contemporary culture. What would you find? You will probably find that political engagement speaks as much to Occupy and Golden Dawn as it does to urban networks of cooperation and mass protests. You will probably also find that storytelling now mobilizes, then immobilizes people. Think of the competing narratives around climate change. You will probably find too that new sincerity may be placed in close approximation to the convention of being frank, and often too frank, as an online persona. Or, as Lee Constantinou argues in a forthcoming article, that post-irony can be seen as the desired attitude for the contemporary tribal modes of working advocated in the Googleplex and the creative economy. And you would also probably find that the contemporary forms of affect are embodied by both Russell Brand and Nigel Farage, and that contemporary forms of craft can be observed in microbreweries, as well as in ever more fine-grained forms of micromanagement of cheap manual labor in companies such as Amazon. So again, these practices cannot be placed in some kind of hierarchy from good to evil. They partly break from the dialectic between labor and capital, and they are partly very conformist strategies within our capitalist economy. They are partly dedicated to alternative forms of political engagement that turn away from traditional politics, and they are partly very convenient for neoliberal politicians who don't need electoral legitimacy to pursue their inverted class war. Yet an analysis of these metamodern practices, that is, an analysis of today's cultural dominance, can be used to map the outer ideological limits of what we can think and what we can do in the 21st century. And to be sure, that is precisely what we attempt to do in our work. So in the final instance then, all of these developments that I've described are problematic. They're problematic in the light of the massive problems we are facing in terms of socioeconomic equality, ecological disaster, and climate change. Again, they are not positive, they are not negative, but they're very problematic indeed. I've just read the economic analysis of Piketty and the policy analysis of Naomi Klein. And when you read them in conjunction, so that's Klein's This Changes Everything, and Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. When you read them in conjunction, they form both a very convincing critique of neoliberal globalization and a passionate rallying cry to start changing the ways in which we have organized our societies. For if we don't, we are heading in 10 or 20 years or so towards a clusterfuck of world historical proportions, in which wealth is concentrated at the top 1% of the pyramid, whilst rising sea levels and extreme weather events crumble its base. where the rest of us reside. And so it is in the light of these developments that our children and our children's children will judge all of our work today. Thank you.